My topic is the story of Democedes in Herodotus Book 3. Despite the factors that Herodotus Histories shows a great interest in medical issues such as health and disease, individual doctors are rarely presented in his narrative. However, Book 3 represents a notable exception. It begins with the Persian account of the reason why Cambyses invaded Egypt, a story in which an anonymous Egyptian eye doctor played an important role, since he suggests to Cambyses that he should ask Amasis, the Egyptian king, for his daughter. More elaborate is the story of Democedes, a Greek doctor from Croton. In his stories, Democedes' name first appears when he is included in the entourage of the Samian tyrant Polycartes during his sea voyage to Oroetes, the Persian satrap in Sardis. As a result of both Polycartes and Oroetes' downfalls, Democedes was further brought to Susa, while the main narrative of Book 3, 129 to 138, covers the period from Democedes' arrival at the Persian court to his return to Croton. His advantage before coming to Sardis was encapsulated at Book 3, chapter 131, with a brief retrospective summary, which is sandwiched between Democedes' healings of Darius and Atossa. Herodotus' account of Democedes' adventures has drawn much scholarly attention. Early scholarship, which broadly accepted its historicity, tended to read the story as a valuable document of medical history. Thus, for instance, the story of Atossa's breast disease was regarded as the first recorded case of inflammatory mastitis. This line of interpretation has been duly criticized by Griffiths and Davies, among others, who argued that the Herodotian narrative of Democedes is from start to finish a tissue of folktale motifs from which one cannot extract one or two details and privilege them with historical status. On the other hand, many scholars have interpreted the medical elements in the Democedes story against the backdrop of contemporary medical writings, while it has also been read as a turning point from the previously more positive imagery of Egyptian medicine among the Greeks. In this paper, I'd like to illuminate Herodotus' portrait of Democedes by comparing it with the story of Egyptian oculist recounted at the beginning of Book 3. My comparative reading will focus on ethical aspects of the Democedes story, which is juxtaposed with the Tashnei theme, which is predominant in its first half. I will argue that why, from the perspective of Tashnei, Democedes is clearly superior to his Egyptian colleagues in the Persian court. His nostos is ethically rather problematic. Scholars have successfully noticed that Herodotus' account of Democedes' healing of Darius is perverted with the language of Tashnei. For one thing, the meeting of Darius, who was suffering from unbearable pains in his foot, and Democedes, who was by then a captive in prison at Susa, was made possible by someone who had been in Sardis and had heard about the skill of Democedes. The Tashnei language is further taken up when Darius asked Democedes whether he understood the art of medicine. Despite the denial of Democedes, Darius considered him to be a skillful physician. Following threat of torture, Democedes finally confessed that although his knowledge of medical art was not exact, he did possess it to a slight degree after having spent time with another doctor. The recurrence of Tashnei language in this episode is continued in the historian description of how Democedes killed Darius. The text on the screen. By using Greek medical techniques and by applying gentle rather than harsh remedies, Democedes enabled Darius to get sleep. Before long, contrary to Darius' expectation of never fully recovering the use of his foot, he was completely better. Democedes' application of Greek remedies, Hellenic koisi iemasi, is emphatically placed at the very beginning of the sentence. Through a participial phrase introduced by an epixegetical kai, the precise procedure of how the Greek doctor relieved Darius of his pain is further clarified. Democedes is said to apply gentle remedies instead of Egyptian doctors' harsh treatment, kai epia metata istriha pos agon. The juxtaposition of Istria and Apia is noteworthy. One might note that both Istria and Apia are neuter plural, as in the case of Hellenic Koisi Iemasi. On a lexical level, the phrase ta Istria evokes the bad spring of Darius, Istrihotechos. More relevant to the context is unmistakable link between the phrase metata Istria and the Egyptian doctor's previously forceful treatment of Darius' foot, which only worsened it. By contrast, Apia pointedly brings out Democedes' mild treatment, which is generally deemed as one of the virtues of Greek medicine. In echoing the language of Apia, which is central to Democedes' application of Greek remedies, Ioanna argues that Egyptian doctors were reviewed as inferior to the Greek doctor. Darius wanted to impair them, but the Greek doctor asked for and obtained their pardon. Even in human relations, the Greek doctor showed his mildness. This line of interpretation might be strengthened by Democedes' intercession for an Leon diviner at the Persian court, who, like the Greek doctor, had been part of Polycarpus' entourage and had been consigned to oblivion among the slaves. More significant is Democedes' behavior towards Atossa when the queen showed him her breast, on which a growth had burst and spread. Before curing her, Democedes made her swear that in return she would do him any favor he asked of her, and he added that he would not ask her to do anything which would cause her shame. Indeed, the reciprocal relationship between the Persian queen and Greek doctor does not cause Atossa any shame, since she was asked to help Democedes to go back home. Together with his intercession for the Egyptian doctors and a Leon diviner at the Persian court, Democedes' proper behavior towards a female patient might be read as a good example of Greek medical ethics. That being said, I would like to argue that while from the perspective of technique, Democedes is clearly superior to the Egyptian doctors at the Persian court, his nostrils is ethically problematic. Since its success nearly came at the cost of the Persian invention of grace. Two issues need to be clarified before I put forward my arguments. First, my discussion of the ethical problem involved in Democedes' nostrils goes beyond the boundary of medical ethics as is commonly understood. However, medical issues are relevant to Democedes' nostrils. While Atossa's bad conversation with Darius is preceded by Democedes' handling of the queen, theory in Atossa's speech, as I will should be known, is conducive to the realization. Second, chapter which attached to the end of Amasis' story. In the Cyrus found to for the different persons from between Atossa. Why sharp to successful return of Democedes, his careful avoidance of plunging Greece into turmoil by launching a massive naval expedition against Italy, serves into relieve the Greek doctor's scheme, which is designed to achieve his nostrils at any cost. This contrast is confirmed by the concluding words of Book 3, chapter 138. So much for these events. These were the first Persians to come to Greece from Asia, and they came as first under circumstances just described. The Persians first episode, the story of Cynoson, is explicitly said to explain the reason why Darius conquered Samos, dia toi ende tina Aitian. In what follows, I'd like to shed some new light on the ethical problem involved in Democedes' nostrils by reading Book 3's two doctor stories as narrative doublets. By a narrative doublet, I mean the construction of two different episodes mirroring each other, each including the same basic events, but often featuring a different set of characters, along with any number of variations or expansions, both great and small. This term was first developed in Homeric studies. In more recent scholarship, it has been fruitfully applied to analyze Herodotian and Cyclopedian narrative. It has been well noted that Book 3's two doctor stories share a common narrative pattern, which concerns the cause of the Persian invasions. However, these two stories differ from all the other examples of the same narrative pattern in that they have a doctor as the main figure. In comparison with the story of the Egyptian eye doctor, it will be shown that Democedes was self-serving itinerant demiurgos who strive to get rid of a Persian despot at any cost. The discussions of Friedman and Pelling have been most helpful for my interpretation. Friedman is interested in location and dislocation in Herodotus. In referring to demiurgoi, a class of professionals, including bards, doctors, and seers, Friedman made a fruitful comparison between the story of Arion in Book 1, 23 to 24, and that of Democedes, who is said to be hired as a public doctor by the Aeginetans. In so doing, she showed how Herodotus highlights the paradigmatic nature of these demiurgoi and their practice of their skill techne. Vital to my argument is Friedman's statement that in the story of Arion, just a hint of a tension between the itinerancy of the demiurgos and his desire for a more centripetal relationship to space becomes with Democedes a profound longing for home that leads the demiurgos to disavow his knowledge of his craft because he is afraid that to acknowledge his expertise will keep him from home forever. Friedman's comparison between Arians and Democedes' itinerant lifestyles on account of their status as demiurgoi might be reinforced by a number of motifs which are common to both tales. Both protagonists were once hired by a great tyrant. Both became very rich because of their respective craft. Both used the scheme to escape from a dangerous situation. Moreover, the presence of other demiurgoi within the Democedes story is remarkable. In the second account of the reason why Oroetes decided to murder Polycrates, the lyric poet Anacreon is said to enjoy the company of Samian tyrant when Oroetes' message approached. According to Herodotus and Pseudo-Plutarch Hipparchus, Anacreon might have moved from Samos to Athens due to the invitation of Hipparchus, a movement which echoes Democedes' own movement from Athens to Samos. Furthermore, in a parallel way to Democedes' intercession for the Egyptian doctors, the Crotonian doctor restituted an Elean diviner who can also be called a demiurgos according to the definition used by Friedman. That being said, there are two significant discrepancies between the story of Arion and that of Democedes in terms of location and dislocation. First, while the former's itinerancy was confined within the Greek world, the latter became a captive first in Sardis and then in Susa. The atmosphere of the Persian court is also notably different from that of Greek city. This remains true even when the city in question is ruled by a tyrant such as Periander or Polycrates. Second, familia plays an important role in the Democedes story, while it is virtually absent in the Arion episode. In these two respects, the story of the Egyptian eye doctor recounted at Book 3, Chapter 1 proves to be far more similar to the Democedes story. For both doctors were forced to work at the Persian court against their own will, and the protagonist, the longing for homecoming, is central to the two doctor stories. These 2 points serve not only to justify the comparative reading of the two doctor story in Book 3, but also to illuminate a difficult passage of the Democedes tale, which many scholars have considered illogical in its Herodotian context. Democedes, though a captive in Sardis, in Susa, denied his medical capacity when he was first brought to Darius and introduced to him, because he was afraid that if he was found out, he would never get back to Greece. In sharp contrast to the view of the Griffiths and Davis, that the detail of Democedes' initial reluctance to hear Darius constitutes an element which is hard to explain without resort to the word of folktale. I contend that this detail not only fits perfectly well with the later development of the story, but also shows how Democedes was anxious to work for Persian despot. For to work for a Persian despot is to lose freedom forever, as the story of the Egyptian occultist seems to suggest. This anxiety of Democedes is brought out most clearly through the following two things, both of which are marked by an unusual narratorial comment. The first thing concerns Democedes' departure from Persia. In the aftermath of the bad conversation between Darius and Atossa, the king decided to send 15 persons in the company of Democedes to Hercules, Greece, warning them that they were to bring Democedes back at all costs without letting him escape. Darius then summoned Democedes and asked him to give the person a thorough tour and description of Greece and then to return. By offering a cargo ship, he further suggests that Democedes should take and bring all his personal property as gifts for his father and brothers. The king promised to replace them many times upon his return. Here, the narrator interverts the text on the screen. Now, in my opinion, these offers by Darius were not meant as a trap, but Democedes was afraid that Darius was testing him. So he did not impetuously accept everything that was offered, but said that he would leave his property behind so that it would be there for him on his return, while accepting the cargo ship which Darius was offering to transport the gifts to his brothers. One might note the difference between Democedes' acceptance of those gifts which were for his brothers and the corresponding part in Darius' original suggestion, which concerns gifts for his father and brothers. The absence of the father in Democedes' reply reminds the reader of the Crotonian doctor's initial conflict with his irascible father, as a result of which he left Croton and went first to Aegina, where he began his career as itinerant doctor. More importantly, the narrator's judgment of Darius' motivation throws Democedes' overcautious attitude into relief, out of fear that Darius was testing him, whereas Darius is in some sense the victim of Democedes' scheme, since his sending of spies to Hercules, Greece was triggered by Atossa's cooperation with Democedes. By contrast, the king's offers to Democedes before his departure were, in historians' opinion at least, not meant as a trap. The narratorial comment just quoted is paralleled by another one which appears in the description of Democedes' last appearance in Histories. After escaping from the Persians in Tarentum, Democedes returned to his hometown Croton. As the Persian followed him there and tried to seize him, his countrymen refused to deliver Democedes to the Persians. When the Persians set out on their return journey, Democedes surprisingly asked them to inform Darius that he was already engaged to marry the daughter of Minor, a renowned athlete. This unexpected move is clarified by the narrator as follows, the text on your screen. For the name of Minor, the wrestler counted a lot at the Persian court. In my view, Democedes paid out a lot of money to arrange this marriage contract in order to make Darius see that he was an important person in his own country. The parallel of the narratorial comment in chapter 135, Dokein A Moi, and chapter 137, Moi Doke A, is striking. While the former comment concerns Darius' offers to Democedes, the latter served to clarify why Democedes needed to ask the Persian spy to inform Darius of his marriage contract with Minor. Democedes' exact motivation behind this unexpected move is disputable. Scholars have read it as an expression of boast, comparable to Odysseus' taunting of the Cyclops when safely out at sea. In my view, however, both Democedes' overcaution at chapter 135 and his last appearance at chapter 137 can be read as a result of the Greek doctor's anxiety about how to communicate with the Persian despot. On the one hand, thanks to his medical craft, the doctor became an important figure to the king. On the other hand, the king, though generous in many aspects, would not endow the doctor with freedom to continue his career as a demiurgos. Instead, before the Persians had departed, Darius commanded them to bring him back to the Persian court at all costs. Since the king regarded the doctor as his own slave, this is evidenced by the Persian Cyrus' threatening words to the inhabitants of Croton, in which Democedes was called not as an itinerant doctor, but rather as one of the runaway slaves of the king. A slave has no freedom to move around. While Democedes wanted to make Darius see that he was an important dokimos person in his own country, one might note that expression vale postakeon echoes kat evane de todakeo in the first encounter between Darius and Democedes, and also please compare an achoteon de me heauton ek venas. My last point is indebted to Panning's explicit juxtaposition of Book 3 with two doctors in his examination of the concept of empire in the Histories. Panning compared the decision process of Cyrus' invention of Greece with Darius' bad conversation with Atossa. On the one hand, both kings are not themselves initially so keen on inventing Greece, yet on the other, it doubt about, but simply a question of prioritizing targets. For Panning, is prey to self-interested people. In addition to Mardonius, who wanted to become the governor of Greece, there are many Greeks who belong to this category, including the exiled Pisistrates, with the oracle monger Onomakaitos reporting only the favorable prophecies and messages from the Anoiade of Thessaly. He first pointed out that these men are not the first dissident Greeks to act on invaders in their own factional interests. There was Democedes of Croton exploiting Queen Atossa to persuade the king because he wants to get home. There were Archistagoras and Histiaios in the Ionian revolt. Together with some other examples such as Egyptian Phanes, the Paeonian Picres, and the Mastues, Panning also mentions the Egyptian physician in order to show that the group of self-interested people includes both Greeks and un-Greeks alike. To be sure, the Egyptian oculists and Democedes are comparable in terms of their self-interest. The protagonist longing for homecoming is central to both stories. However, the extent to which, that is my point, they are involved in the Persian king's decision to attack their own country is considerably different. The Egyptian oculist suggesting to Cambyses that he ask the Egyptian king for his daughter is clearly intended to avenge himself on Amasis, who was held responsible for the physician's separation from his wife and children. For, as a result of his suggestion, Amasis was forced to either send his beloved daughter to Persia or make an enemy of Cambyses. In other words, like his own suffering, the Egyptian oculist aimed to make Amasis suffer full separation from his daughter. The vengeance of Egyptian oculist, however, is complicated by the following events. Even though the physician was in no way directly responsible, Amasis, who knew that Cambyses would treat his daughter not as a royal wife, but rather as a concubine, sent Nitatis, the daughter of his predecessor Archias, instead. Nitatis ended up telling the truth to Cambyses. It was likely that she did so as a deliberate act of revenge on Amasis, who rebelled against and murdered her father. As a result, Cambyses decided to attack Egypt, since he was angry with Amasis, who deceived him. Hence, if we accept the Persian version of the story, as historians seem to prefer, Cambyses' invention of Egypt can be traced back to a set of two rangeful acts, meaning that the suggestion of the Egyptian eye doctor is not directly responsible for Cambyses' decision to attack his own country. On the contrary, Democedes' involvement in Darius' plan to attack Greece is far more direct than his Egyptian counterpart in the case of Cambyses' invasion of Egypt. This is evidenced by the fact that Book 3, chapter 133 to 37 is simply a narrative of Democedes' Nostos framed as his guidance of a group of Persian spies reconstructing Greece, and the precondition of which is Darius' agreement to attack Greece. My aim is here to show the sophisticated way in which Herodotus embedded a medical theory into Atossa's mouth in her bad conversation with Darius, which begins as follows. The chapter 3 letter after Democedes had made her better, Atossa and Darius were in bed together and acting on Democedes' instruction. She put the following proposal to Darius: "My lord, you have so much power, but you do nothing with it. You aren't trying to gain further territory or increase the Persian Empire. One would expect a man with youth and vast material resource at his disposal to make the Persians realize that they are being ruled by a real man. By conspicuously accomplishing some significant achievement. In fact, there are two reasons why it's to your advantage to do this, not just to make the Persians understand that their ruler is a real man, but also to keep them ground down by warfare and too busy to conspire against you. And now is the time for you to act and make your mark while you are young, because while the body is growing, the mind is growing along with it. But as the body ages, the mind ages too and goes into general decline." Through a ring composition in the Dastesa and Ecdidaches, the narrator makes clear that Atossa's speech is owed to Democedes' instruction. Her speech can be divided into 4 parts. First, Atossa contrasts the power with his inaction in terms of imperial expansion. Second, this imbalance is further reinforced by the Persian people's noble expectation of a young despot. Third, this expansionist policy is said to have 2 advantages for Darius. In addition to meet the Persians' expectation of true ruler, it also makes them too busy to conspire against the king. Fourthly, and most importantly for my interpretation, Atossa concludes that the expansion of the Persian Empire should be put into action right now, noon, while Darius is still young, Heos Neos, Ace Henikian. The last point is followed by a proverbial sentence which concludes Atossa's speech. To summarize the first half of Atossa's speech, expansionism is the only option for any Persian despot in terms of necessity and benefit. Because of this, Atossa went to argue for an immediate action on Darius' part. Darius assured his wife that an invasion of Scythia would be realized soon, as he had already planned. One might note that Oligush Konu, soon in Darius' reply refers back to noon now in Atossa's speech. But the queen, who disagrees with Darius' plans for invasion, just suggested to him to attack Greece first for 2 reasons. First, she would like to have Greek girls as servants. Second, Democedes was available as the best possible person to guide. Darius then accepted her suggestion. As Penning puts it, when Atossa seeks to persuade Darius to invade Greece, any hesitation is not based on doubt about the case of aggression. It is just a matter of which nation to touch it first. To be sure, the most significant parallel in the Histories is Theseus' considerations of whether to attack Egypt or Greece first.